Hey, thanks for joining us. We're in the middle, we're just about to get into our weather brief discussion. So every time we go fly, we're going to get a weather brief just like this, and we're going to interpret it every time. So it starts here at the table of contents, and it looks like we've got, you can just jump to whatever section you want to go to. But I like to go just from the top to bottom and talk about each individual topic. So looking here, temporary flight restrictions, none. That's great. That's exactly what it sounds like. It's a flight restriction in the airspace that is temporary. We also have closed or unsafe NOTAMs. This is basically saying that this airport might be closed or there might be a runway closed. It doesn't look like there's anything in the flight plan that I filed today. So our departure point Payne does not have any closures, neither does Bellingham or our alternates Arlington or Skagit. Next, we've got SIGMETs, convective SIGMETs, and airmets. These are hazardous weather. So airmets typically are hazardous for small airplanes like us. So we'll see something like mountain obscurations, instrument conditions, turbulence or icing. And at the airmet level, it's usually moderate, not terrible for the airliners. SIGMETs are going to be much more severe, so severe icing, turbulence. And then convective SIGMETs usually have to do with thunderstorm activity. So if you see any of these, it might give you pause, you might pump the brakes a little bit. And today it does look like we have an airmet for instrument conditions. So we look here, it says IFR airmet. So in the airspace that we're flying in, it is likely to be IFR conditions. There is a warning saying that there are conditions that might make it instrument flight rules, which means that you legally have to have an instrument rating and be on an instrument clearance or an instrument flight plan to fly in that airspace in those conditions. Let's see, moving on, we also have more airmets for IFR conditions. Here's our other airmet, mountain obscuration. This is saying that there are clouds low enough that they will obscure mountains. And so don't fly into the clouds because you might fly into a mountain. And since we're VFR, we shouldn't be flying into the clouds anyway. Moving on, more airmets for mountain obscurations. Here's another airmet for icing conditions. This means that at the freezing level, there is sufficient moisture to develop structural icing. So it is cold enough and it is wet enough for our wings and other surfaces to develop structural icing, which is bad for us because that decreases our ability to generate lift and it increases our drag as well. All right, moving on, more airmets. Here's our freezing level. This tells us the altitude we can expect to encounter freezing conditions. So if we couple this altitude, 4,000 feet, with clouds or rain or snow or whatever, we will likely encounter freezing conditions and icing conditions at that altitude. Here we have a few more: no turbulence, low altitude, high altitude, no strong surface winds, no low-level wind shear, no urgent PIREPs, no center weather advisories, and no severe weather, and no volcanic ash. So all that is good. That's what we want to see when we go fly. None. All right, next, our synopsis or surface analysis chart. This kind of gives us a brief or a quick shot of what the weather patterns are doing around the country. They're really cool. Like over here, this blue icicle looking thing, that's a cold front. That's cold air moving south from the north into the United States. Usually you'll see cumulus clouds or big fluffy clouds ahead of a cold front. This warm front moving from the southwest to the northeast is usually going to have stratiform clouds or big flat clouds, stratus clouds. We've got an elongated area of low pressure, this dashed orange line. That's called a trough. And so we've got another warm front here, another cold front here. When we have alternating cold and warm, that's a stationary front. That's two fronts smashing together and kind of just staying put. And then purple up here, that's an occluded front. So that is when multiple fronts have caught up to each other. So you've got cold, warm, and cold, and it's kind of occluded or hidden, I guess. And then these lines here, these little like circles and squiggly lines, the gray ones, those are isobars or lines of equal atmospheric pressure. And when they're spaced out evenly, that's a steady change in air pressure. When they're really close together, that means that there's a very abrupt change in air pressure, and it might lead to some interesting weather. Next, we've got our METARs, or our meteorological aerodrome reports. This is the hourly weather at the airfield. Yeah, we have a question.
So when you go out to
Yeah.
what are those like big?
This? Oh yeah, so down here we've got a legend that tells you that is likely going to be snow or precipitation. So like this green stuff here, that's rain. This is a mix, and then this right here is snow. And it looks like it's pretty light. Yeah, good question. All right, next are meteorological aerodrome reports. This is the hourly weather at a particular airfield. And it's color-coded, so you can kind of see at a glance what the weather is doing. And here at Payne, Arlington, Whidbey, Skagit, and Bellingham, it looks like it's all IFR conditions. And that means that you have to have an instrument rating, an instrument-equipped aircraft, a flight plan, and a clearance to fly in that airspace in these conditions. And it looks like we've got low IFR with fog, wind at from 100 at 5 knots, 1/2 mile of visibility, runway 16 right, visual range is greater than 6,000 feet, and the ceiling is 200 feet. So that means that once you climb out of the field at 200 feet above the surface, you're already in the clouds. The temperature and dew point. The temperature is just the temperature at the field, 7 degrees Celsius. But the dew point is the point at which air becomes saturated with moisture. So if you were to cool the field down from 7 to 6 degrees Celsius, you will have visible fog or clouds. So whenever these two numbers are really close together, it is likely that we will have fog or clouds, or low-level clouds. Next is the altimeter setting, 3020. That tells you the air pressure setting for your altimeter. It tells the altimeter, hey, the air pressure at sea level is this, and it will tell you your current altitude above sea level. And then the density altitude is the altitude at which the airplane feels like it's flying. And we'll talk about the different flavors of altitude later, but the short version is the density altitude is the altitude that the airplane will feel like it's flying at. So if you're flying at Payne, which is 600 feet above sea level, it feels like we are actually below sea level by almost 400 feet. So the air is nice and dense, nice and tight. So we have more grip with our propeller, with our wings. So we're gonna have a little better performance in a low density altitude day. And you can interpret this for all of the airfields. There's a bunch of different airports with METARs here. We're just gonna move on. I'm not gonna dwell too much on it. Next is our PIREPs. These are pilot reports. Anytime a pilot reports something, like the other day I was flying on final, and all of a sudden the plane just gets shook up. We lose 50 feet. We lose about 10 knots of airspeed. And we're just getting tossed around. We're like, man, we got some really heavy turbulence. And so we let them know, like, hey, we've got some pretty hard wind shear up here. And they're like, yeah, we're just about to announce that there's a center weather advisory for hazardous winds or like high winds. Like, ooh. So that was kind of neat. But it looks like we have negative turbulence today. A pilot reported that there was negative turbulence, and it looks like over Payne Field at 8:23 local time, altitude 800 feet, and it was a Cessna 700 citation. The sky conditions, the bases, overcast clouds were 800 feet. Next is our flight category. This will tell us what the conditions are at different fields, and it looks like low IFR in the purple, IFR in the little like pinkish, and then marginal VFR in the blue. It looks like we're just going to be in IFR conditions for the most part for this flight. And the ceiling between 500 and 700 feet. And they're pretty easy to interpret. Like once you see them, like, all right, I just look at a glance at Bellingham, it looks like the ceiling's around 1,000 feet. And just look at the legend. Too easy. Moving on. Not going to spend too much time on it. Same thing with visibility. It's color-coded, so it should be pretty easy to determine what the visibility is. That means like if you were looking straight out, how far can you see, right? Cloud cover, same deal. Looks like over Payne, overcast at 1,100, and the top is at flight level 310. That means that the clouds start at 1,100 feet above the field, and they go all the way up to 31,000 feet. So it's a pretty thick cloud layer today. Moving on. Precipitation, rain, yeah. Thunder coverage, nothing today. That's cool. All right, here's our winds. One of these barbs, the long ones are 5 knots. The long ones are 10 knots. The short ones are 5 knots. So it looks like we've got wind at 10 knots coming from the southwest to the northeast. This one's 15 knots. And if you ever see a red barb, that's gusting winds. So winds, there's the black barb, which will tell you the steady wind, and then the red will usually be a gusting wind. Okay, moving on. Not going to spend too much time on this because we don't have a whole day. Is that a question? Nope. Cool. Okay, cool. Freezing level. All right, here's our terminal aerodrome forecast. So this is read similar to a METAR, but it actually tells us what we expect to see later on in the day, not the actual current conditions. So today we expect to see the field go marginal VFR with winds from 110 at 6, 3 miles visibility, mist and showers, and the ceiling goes overcast at 1,200 feet. So it would be legal to fly, but the question is, would you want to fly in marginal conditions, for your particular flight? And then later it'll drop back down to IFR. It's overcast at 800. And you can spend more time reading this. This is free, by the way. If you go to 1-800-WXBrief.com, you can pull up a weather brief every day of the week. I do these 5 times a day, so I get really comfortable understanding what the weather is going to do. Next, our winds aloft. This is our wind direction, temperature, and velocity, and temperatures at different altitudes. So at 3,000 feet over SeaTac, the winds are 250 at 7, and because it's close to the airfield, they're not going to give you the altitude or the temperature. At 6,000 feet, it is -1 degree Celsius. And so you can see at different altitudes, the winds will change directions and be colder typically. Here's our convective outlook. It looks like there's a slight or an enhanced risk of thunderstorm activity down south in Louisiana. I go back there. Here's our NOTAMs, or our notices to air missions. Again, this is anything that didn't make it into the publications, and there are obstructions within 10 nautical miles of Payne. Oh, there's also the VOR is unserviceable from January 7th at 7 local to 1500 local. And of course, we got Zulu time. And here are more NOTAMs. Notices to air missions. There's a tower or something 674 feet above sea level, or 150 feet above ground level. That's an obstruction. Crane, another crane. So there's a bunch of stuff around the field that could potentially be hazardous to us if we're flying too low. And you can practice reading all these. There's a ton of them. It'd be a good idea to practice reading these so you know how to interpret them at a glance without having to read 50 pages of NOTAMs, because it gets tedious. All right, and that covers NOTAMs.